Well, thanks to the Heartland Institute, and thanks to Senator Inhofe, not just for his many years of work on this subject, but for saying that the economics is what's most important, because that's what I'll be talking about now. I'll be discussing the economics of global warming policy, especially the cost of the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. I guess I can call it cap and trade. Congressman Sensenbrenner's gone. Bill currently working through the House of Representatives, and I'll focus on the Heritage Foundation's economic analysis of that bill. But before I do that, I wanted to try to be the glue that holds this whole day together and sort of set out a framework for which to judge Waxman-Markey or any other measure offered up as a solution to the global warming problem, a set of questions that need to be answered before we enact any global warming measures, especially costly measures. The first question is one that's the main focus of this event and its highly distinguished panel of scientific experts. And that's how much of a problem is man-made global warming. After all, Waxman-Markey or any other solution is a solution only to the extent that there's a problem in the first place. A second question asked is that even if you assume global warming to be a problem, how much of it will be solved by the policy under consideration? In other words, even if you assume that the increasing trajectory of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations is causing net harm. And let's put aside the IDSO family's excellent work showing the plant growth benefits of increased carbon dioxide, and let's assume that there's a net harm from that increase. Well, how much of that harm will be alleviated? How much of that rising trajectory will be reduced by the policy measure in question? Are we eliminating 100% or 25% or only a few percent? And consequently, how much will the Earth's temperature actually be reduced? A lot, a little, enough to even notice? And these are especially important questions to ask of a unilateral measure like Waxman-Markey. And a third question to ask is whether this particular solution to global warming has been tried elsewhere, and how well has it worked? What is the real-world experience with this approach? And here there are valuable lessons from Europe, which did us the favor of moving much faster than the U.S. and has already implemented a cap-and-trade approach that's embodied in Waxman-Markey. And this real-world experience needs to be taken into account here. And the fourth question to ask is whether there are better ways of addressing global warming, or for that matter, better things to address than global warming, looking at all the challenges that present generations face and future generations will face. What's the best use of our resource? So as I discuss the Waxman-Markey bill, keep this framework in mind. Let's start out with a very quick overview of what cap and trade is. I know not all of you follow it in that much detail. The cap part of cap and trade refers to a cap on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide. The problem being that this is the coal, oil, natural gas that provides 85% of our energy, and there's no cheap way to easily or significantly reduce those emissions anytime soon. The Waxman-Markey bill requires a 3% reduction from 2005 baseline levels in 2012 and rises to 17% by 2020 and 83% by 2050. There'll be some fuel switching from coal to natural gas and an increase in alternatives, especially if they continue to be subsidized and may actually be mandated. But for the most part, if you look at these targets as energy rationing, you'll be correct. And you'll be even more correct if you view them as an energy tax in disguise. Now, who would be directly regulated? Electric utilities, oil refiners, natural gas producers, and some manufacturers that produce energy on site. So the good news for the rest of us, homeowners, car owners, small business owners, property owners, farmers, the good news is that we won't be directly regulated under Waxman-Markey. The bad news is that almost all the costs will get passed on to us anyway. Now, each of these regulated entities would be given free or required to purchase enough rights to emit carbon dioxide for their activities. These rights to emit each ton, called allowances, would be tradable commodities, so those who have extras can sell them to those who don't. That's the trade part of cap and trade. And over time, the annual amount of these allowances goes down. Now, I'm not going to put you through any more torture about the details of this 900-page bill, but a few things I'd like to point out. One factor that affects the cost of the bill is the provision for offsets. Offsets mean that instead of companies reducing their emissions, they can essentially pay somebody else to reduce theirs or engage in projects that supposedly reduce them. They're both domestic and international offsets. And the thing that makes offsets so important is that for regulated companies, actually having to reduce their emissions is always the least desirable option because it's the most expensive one. So anything that lets them off the hook will be used to the fullest extent possible. And the amount of offsets allowed in Waxman-Markey is big enough that they could greatly reduce the cost, at least conceivably. But in the bill, these offsets are subject to a lot of red tape, a lot of oversight before they're deemed acceptable. And this is because there have been many instances of fraud with offsets, especially international international ones, instances of phony emissions reductions and the like. One colorful example involved factories in China that were deliberately built to emit more greenhouse gases, just as the Chinese government could be paid big sums by European nations to make the relatively cheap facility changes and lower those emissions. So Waxman-Markey allows for domestic and international offsets, but has very tough and unprecedented procedures to prevent fraud or try to prevent fraud. And the upshot is it's hard to say how much offsets will qualify and actually be used. But for all our analysis, we assume some, but not all. We assume 15% of the compliance obligations will be met with offsets. Now, one other thing that happened with Waxman-Markey that has gotten a lot of attention as it went from a draft proposal to a bill that was debated and passed out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee was the allocation of allowances. President Obama had endorsed cap and trade with 100% auction of allowances. That is, regulated entities had to pay for all of them and got none for free. And we're talking about something worth hundreds of billions each year. On the other side, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, a coalition of many major corporations and some environmental groups, they asked for some of these allowances for free, and they clearly had a role in drafting Waxman-Markey, which gave them what they wanted. I thought President Obama actually had the right idea with no free allowances, because it means that none of these companies can be bought off in this manner. But in the end, 85% of the allowances have been promised for free. The biggest winners are the electric utilities, which get 35%. Some energy-intensive manufacturers also made out well. So only 15% of the allowances will be auctioned, at least in the initial years of the bill, and even that may get promised away as the bill moves forward. But these free allowances do not lower the cost of Waxman-Markey. They just shift them around. Keep in mind the targets are still the targets, and the way they work is by inflicting economic pain. After all, if the cost of electricity or gasoline stayed the same, individuals and businesses would use just as much, and the targets would not be met. Prices have to go up in order to force people to use less energy. So anyone who's bought off with free allowances means the costs for everyone else are that much higher. So for those of you in this room who haven't hired one of the 2,400 lobbyists working on this issue, it probably means that whatever free allowances they get for their clients, that Waxman-Markey will cost you that much more. And as far as I know, none of the 2,400 lobbyists are registered to work for the American consumer. Now, these free allocations also mean that the pot of money that the government collects from auction revenues will be lower. This is money that could have been used for various purposes like rebates to low-income households that would otherwise be disproportionately burdened by the higher energy prices, or to fund the next big health care plan. But available revenues that could be redistributed are made smaller by all the allowances given away. Now, I should stop and say that if all this sounds confusing, cap and trade, cap and tax, remember that's exactly the point. This is an energy tax in disguise. Congressman Sensenbrenner was right. Energy prices go up, but it's done in such a roundabout and convoluted manner that the hope is the public doesn't recognize it as a tax, at least not until it's too late. Otherwise, it would suffer the same fate as the 1993 BTU tax, which was both defeated and became a political liability for those who had supported it. So what are the costs? Well, the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis modeled the impact, and I'd like to thank David Kreutzer, who's here, Bill Beach, and Karen Campbell for their fine work and direct all the difficult questions to them. We used the Global Insight macroeconomic model to predict the future economy, and we modeled the change to the future economy caused by Waxman-Markey. Now, I would be remiss, especially in this room, people who know very well the limitations of climate models, not to mention that many of those same limitations apply to economic models. So I offer up these numbers only as estimates, but I can say that unlike some climate modelers, we did not use questionable assumptions to skew the results. And in fact, we gave Waxman-Markey the benefit of the doubt in many respects. For example, we rather optimistically assumed 36 billion gallons of the ethanol mandate will be met in 2022, which of course will take some pressure off gasoline price, but we made that assumption even though we've already seen significant problems in 2008 with only 9 billion gallons. Also, we carry out our model only to 2035 and not further, because beyond that we deemed it too speculative. Even though if we carried out further, we would have come up with larger total costs. In contrast, some of the lowball estimates of cap and trade that some of you may have seen, such as from the Environmental Protection Agency, they invariably involve several far-fetched assumptions to get the cost down. In EPA's case, they made very optimistic assumptions about carbon capture and sequestration and nuclear power. They assumed very modest economic growth out of line with the rest of the administration's projections, and they use a high discount rate to come up with a lower present value of future costs. Well, in our analysis, the higher energy costs kick in as soon as the bill's provisions take effect in 2012. For a household of 4, energy costs go up $436 that year. They eventually reach $1,241 in 2035. They average $829 per year over that span. Electricity costs go up $468, gasoline $565, natural gas $161, That's a 58% increase in gas prices, 90% for electricity, 55% for natural gas, 56% for heating oil. Cumulative higher energy costs for household of four from 2012 to 2035 would reach nearly $20,000. But direct energy cost is only part of the consumer impact, since higher energy costs raise the price of nearly everything. And if you look at the total cost of Waxman Markey as reflected in the allocations and offsets, it works out to about $4,600 for a household of four. And most of that $4,600 would be passed down to the public, so it is a good rough gauge of the ultimate cost. Now, that's just the impact on individuals and households. The higher energy costs also impacts employment, and especially employment in the manufacturing sector. We estimate job losses averaging 1,145,000 at any given time from 2012 to 2030. And note that these are net job losses after the much-hyped green jobs are taken into account. Some of the lost jobs will be destroyed entirely, while others will be outsourced to nations like China and India that have repeatedly stated that they would never hamper their own economic growth with energy cost-boosting global warming measures like Waxman Markey. And I should add that these costs are not distributed evenly. As I mentioned, the burden of higher energy costs disproportionately hurts the poor, who spend a larger percentage of their incomes on energy. The Congressional Budget Office has been very clear on this point. And of course, any attempts to try to make low-income households whole by redistributing the auction proceeds gets a lot harder with all these free allowances. So it's not only a tax, but it's a highly regressive tax. Waxman Markey also hurts some regions of the country much more than others, particularly the industrial Midwest, which, unlike the West Coast and Northeast, still has manufacturing jobs to lose, and also those areas that get a larger percentage of their electricity from coal, which is the hardest hit energy source. So keep in mind that these national numbers in our analysis understates how badly worst hit the worst persons and regions are hit. The overall gross domestic product losses will average $491 billion per year from 2012 to 2035, and a cumulative GDP loss of $9.4 trillion by 2035. That's $9.4 trillion with a T. The increase in the national debt by 2035 for a family of four is 26%, or $115,000. In sum, quite a price tag, unprecedented in many ways. Now to try to wrap things up and to integrate the rest of today's discussion, let's ask whether it's worth it. Back to the question of how much of a problem is global warming in the first place. I really can't add anything to the excellent talks we've heard today. It's clear that both the seriousness and the imminence of anthropogenic overwarming have been greatly inflated. My rule of thumb, and I think it's been verified today, is that virtually everything you hear about global warming that sounds terrifying is not true, and what is true falls very well short of being terrifying. The risks of global warming are outweighed by the risks of ill-advised global warming policy like Waxman Markey. But even assuming global warming is a problem, how much of it will be alleviated by Waxman Markey? Proponents of this cap-and-trade bill scare us with the usual gloom and doom litany: sea level rise, more storms, more disease. But even if you accept the litany, how much of it will go away thanks to Waxman Markey? Proponents of the bill rarely address this question, and for good reason, because globally speaking, Waxman Markey would have a trivial impact on future concentrations of greenhouse gases. The bill only binds the U.S., and the trends in the rest of the world are clear that emissions are rising. China alone now out-emits the U.S., and it hasn't just inched ahead, it has raced ahead with emissions rising 6 times faster than ours. A similar story is true, not quite as severe, but a similar story of many other rapidly developing nations. And the notion that if we bind ourselves first, that China will be more inclined to follow our lead is most likely the opposite of the truth, the opposite of what usually happens in international negotiations. I should also add that until the recent recession came along, most Western European and other nations that had signed on to the Kyoto Protocol global warming treaty had been seeing their emissions rising as well. Taking all this into account, climate scientist Chip Nabenberger of New Hope Environmental Services, in a series of blog posts for masterresource.org that was turned into a paper for the Science and Public Policy Institute, he calculates that Waxman Markey would reduce the Earth's future temperature by 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2100, an amount too small to even notice. And I've yet to see a decent refutation of the assertion that the temperature impact would be that inconsequential. We also need to look at how well cap-and-trade has fared elsewhere. And here Gabriel's Calzada's analysis of Spain, which like the rest of Western Europe has had a cap-and-trade program in place since 2005, is extremely valuable. And like most of the rest of Western Europe, Spain has higher unemployment, higher energy costs, and has seen its greenhouse gas emissions increasing anyway, in many cases faster than in the U.S. That's right. Many nations with cap-and-trade have had faster rates of emissions growth than the U.S. has had without it. And there are reasons for this counterproductive result, why cap-and-trade is not only the wrong approach for the economy, but maybe the wrong approach for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Any sensible approach to global warming has to center on technological innovation as it applies to energy production and use. Innovation is what we really want. And we know from long experience that free economies innovate better than centrally planned ones.
but cap and trade introduces a significant element of central planning and thus would stifle innovation. We also know that strong economies innovate better than weak ones, and cap and trade weakens economies. And stable economies innovate better than unstable ones, especially for something like energy where investments are great and the payoffs play out over decades. But cap and trade adds instability, and indeed in Europe, we've seen wild swings in the price of carbon allowances and companies seemingly less interested in long-term investment and more interested in short-term gaming of the system. So in conclusion, I think it's free markets, even ones like ours that run on fossil fuels and will continue to do so. Free markets provide us with the best solution. The wealth they create, which according to our study is $9.4 trillion more without Waxman-Markey than with, that wealth will give us the resilience and the adaptive capacity to deal with whatever challenges the future brings, whether man-made global warming or much more likely something else entirely. Thank you.